Thank you, Lynn. We read at the beginning of the service from the Gospel according to John. Now we're going to be reading from Matthew's Gospel. We'll be reading from the 2nd chapter, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time that the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I might go and pay him homage." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I'd like you all to take just a second to consider one of the most important, special, formative, whatever your choice, events of your life. So just think, it doesn't have to be one in particular, but just think of an event that you would say was a very crucial moment in your life. Maybe it's a wedding day, birth of a child, start of a new job, graduation from high school, whatever it may be. And think about that. All right, hopefully you've all thought of something. Do you think that you could do justice to that event by trying to describe it in only 8 sentences? If you were to write down and record the significance of that event, do you think that you could do that in 8 sentences? My guess is that the answer is no, that it wouldn't do justice to what you wanted to communicate about that event. That it was this one thing in your life, of many perhaps, but this one thing that you have chosen was so significant that you could scarcely fit it on a page, much less 8 sentences. For those of you who do diaries or keep journals, you're probably someone who would say, "I can barely keep on a page the things that I've done in a given day." I mean, I've seen people put more detail than 8 sentences into what they had for dinner on Facebook on a given day than 8 sentences. And the reason that I'm bringing up these 8 sentences is in this story that I just read from Matthew's Gospel, we have the story of the wise men or the magi, the visitors that came to Jesus' side that followed a star for weeks or months, maybe even longer, ended up in Jerusalem, talked to King Herod, went to Bethlehem, knelt by Jesus' side, paid homage and worshiped him, and they get 8 sentences. 8 sentences. That is the entirety of what we know in the scriptures about the Magi. And so for the next 4 weeks, I want to spend a little more time digging into the wise men, aka the Magi, talking about their story, talking about what we can learn from it, talking about some of the things that you may or may not have heard about them, that we can supplement their story, and how I think that they can help us have greater appreciation for what the birth of Jesus Christ represents, not just in their time, but in our time. I think that they can inspire us to elevate our own spirituality, to up our game faithfully in terms of the preparations and the readiness that we make in this season of Advent. So, some of you are probably saying, well, wait a minute now. I think we've gone a little bit out of order. If you are a liturgical purist and you follow the liturgical calendar, you are probably saying to yourself, this doesn't seem right. The wise men are not supposed to be recognized or even named until after Christmas. They come on Epiphany, and you would be right about that. It's Christmas, and then we count down 12 days, and then the wise men come. Now, I have known people who have been so liturgically pure that they would not even add the wise men to their nativity scene at home until 12 days after Christmas. I have been in churches that have insisted on not singing We Three Kings as a carol until Christmas has passed and Epiphany has arrived. And to you liturgical purists, I would say, good for you, but bah humbug. We're going to start talking about them now. I want to start talking about the Magi now because I think that they are an important part of the story. And in this topsy-turvy year, we might as well tell the story a little bit in reverse. So we're going to talk about the Magi, and we've heard the 8 sentences that the Bible devotes to them. Right? We've heard all that there is to know. What is that? Well, they come from the east. They followed the star at its rising. They are star watchers of some kind, and they got at least as far as Jerusalem, where they consulted the religious experts who said, if there was a child to be born in this region, that would be the Messiah. It would be in Bethlehem. So they go to Bethlehem, and then after being warned in a vision or a dream not to go the way they came, they go home by a different road. And when they come, they encounter Jesus, they're overcome with joy, and they offer gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Those are the 8 sentences. That's what we got. Now, some of you are familiar with the concept of midrash. Midrash in the Jewish tradition is supplemental texts that complement something that we read about in the Scripture. So, for example, if you were to look in the Old Testament and you were to read about Miriam, Moses' sister, and you say, gosh, I wish I knew more about Miriam. Well, you're not alone because there is midrash or extra text that talks about Miriam. Now, it doesn't make it into the Bible. It's not in the Torah. It's not in our Bible, but there are extra texts and extra legends and stories about Miriam that supplement her story. And so if you are curious about that, you can read about that, you can Google that, and there is lots of other midrash that supplements things that are in the Bible. The same is true with parts of the New Testament, although we don't call it midrash, but we call them extra-biblical writings or non-canonical writings because they don't fit within the biblical canon. Okay, and so that's where we find out that there is a wealth of information about the wise men or the Magi. And just so you know, over the season of Advent, I'm going to use those 2 terms interchangeably, wise men and Magi, which we're basically talking about the same thing. So the first thing that I want to share with you as we start to learn more about the Magi is that we have this number of 3. Now, as I've said to you before, my familiarity with the 3 wise men probably came first and foremost from the story of the 3 kings and singing We Three Kings. That's in the United Methodist Hymnal. I sang that growing up. We sang it at family Christmas caroling events. We Three Kings of Orient are. You know that song probably. You've heard that before. And so what's with the number 3? If you go back and look at Matthew's text, you will find that in nowhere in the Bible does it say that there were 3 kings or that there were kings, but they were called the wise men or the Magi. So why is it that we have the number 3? Well, this actually goes way back further than any carols that were written about the event. We can go back into some ancient artwork and find that 3 was the number that came to represent the Magi. If you were to go to Rome, Italy today, just outside the borders of the town, there is a catacomb, and it's called the Catacomb of Priscilla. There are catacombs all over the ancient world, and Christians used to gather in catacombs, one, to bury the dead, but also because during times of persecution, they would go into the catacombs underground and hide there and be able to worship in safety. And these catacombs are sometimes very elaborately decorated, and in the Catacomb of Priscilla, there is a depiction in fresco of the 3 Magi bringing gifts to the infant Jesus. And there they are, pictured 1, 2, and 3. Another representation, which we have a slide for this morning, was done in mosaics. You can find this in mosaic tile in eastern Italy. And here again, we have the 3 Magi. If you were to see what's over on the right side of the screen, you'll see that they are walking toward Mary and Jesus to bring these gifts to the baby Jesus. Again, 1, 2, 3 magi depicted. So where do we get the number 3 from? Well, there's nothing special about the number 3 except for that's the different types of gifts that are brought to Jesus: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So legend has always said, well, if there were 3 different kinds of gifts, perhaps those came from 3 different wise men, and maybe there were 3 of them. But there's nothing to say that there wasn't a whole entourage of these star followers who came by camel or donkey or however they got there. And they might have compiled their gifts, and when they looked at what they had brought, cumulatively there was gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I mean, maybe that's what happened. So we don't know, but that's where we get the number 3 from. Years ago when I was in college, I had a month of study abroad, and one of the places that we went was Italy. And it was in January, so it was right after Epiphany. And I noticed that on the door heads of all of the churches that we visited, somebody had done what looked to be like this kind of cryptic graffiti. And it said, MCB. And some of you know what I'm talking about. And it was written in chalk on the doorposts of all of these churches. And one of the people leading the trip was a priest, and I asked the priest, I said, so what does this mean? We're seeing this in all the churches. This can't be just coincidental. He said, oh, that's there to welcome the Magi. We've just had Epiphany. I said, welcome the Magi? What do you mean? And he said, well, those are the first initials of their names. And I said, the Magi have names? This is all new to me. And he said, yes, the M is for Melchior, the C is for Casper, and the B is for Balthazar. And I said, where in the Bible is this? He said, it's not in the Bible. It's just part of legend. Well, in doing a little bit more research on that, I found that in the 8th century, these Magi, the 3 of them, if there were 3, received their names. Melchior, Casper, or sometimes spelled with a G, Gaspar, and Balthazar. So what's up with that? These are unusual names, right? Well, these were names that just added to the story. And so some of what we will find in this extra biblical material is that these are things that are going to be hard to point to and say these are historically factual things, but instead, rather than be consumed with thinking about what is historically accurate or factual, let's instead think about what truth they communicate. Do they point to something bigger? Do they help tell a richer story that gives us a bigger understanding of what's going on here? And that's what's going to be something that I'm going to want us to focus on as we continue on through this month. So another thing that happens in the story is that by the time we get to about the time when they have their names, we find out about what happened to them. Well, the legend goes that after visiting the baby Jesus in Bethlehem, they were so moved and taken by what had happened that they decided to all go to India, and establish a church. Now, if this account is actually true, we would find that the Magi were then probably the ones to establish the very first Christian church. I mean, churches weren't a thing until after the resurrection. So if these guys went and started to build a facility to worship an infant, they were the first ones to start a church, which would mean that the first Christian church was in India. And so while they are in India, the legend says that they built this church and they lived out their days there and they worshiped there. And then, and this is where the story gets even more bizarre, they all died on the same day. And then their bodies were buried on the church property. Well, this was the legend that persisted for a long time. And then Helen, Constantine's mother, remember Constantine was the first Christian emperor. His mother, Helen, goes to India, finds the church, exhumes the remains of the Magi, takes them back to Constantinople, and buries them there in the great cathedral, which today is known as Hagia Sophia, the mosque. Well, it was originally the church. Well, then later on, they were taken to Milan and put in a church in Milan, Italy, until the Archbishop of Milan asked for assistance in battle when Milan was fighting against Rome. And he called up to the northern neighbors up in Cologne, Germany, and the Archbishop of Cologne said, sure, we'll send reinforcements for you. They came down, they helped them defeat the Romans, and now the people of Milan were thankful, and the Archbishop of Milan said, I will gift you the remains of the Magi to Cologne. And so to this day, the remains of the three magi are said to be in a sarcophagus that is in the great cathedral of Rome, or of Cologne in Germany. After World War II, the great cathedral was about the only thing left standing that wasn't bombed to smithereens in Cologne. And within that church, again, is this gold sarcophagus that keeps the remains of the Magi, or so legend says. So I told you that they had names, Melchior, Balthazar, and Gaspar. And what's up with that? These are names that are certainly don't roll off the tongue. I have yet to meet a Melchior, a Balthazar, or a Gaspar in my life. And if I do, that will be an exciting day. But until then, these point to something different, which is these would have been names that in that day and time would have been more common in certain regions. So Melchior was reported to be originally from the area of Persia, or present-day Iran. Then we had Balthazar, who was one who was supposedly came from Arabia, or according to some traditions, Ethiopia. So he may be from the Arabian Peninsula, or may be from Northeast Africa. And then we have Gaspar, who was said to have come originally from India, which may be why it was by his recommendations that they went back to India and planted that church. So all of this information points to some very interesting, albeit cryptic, details about who they were. And the last thing I want to share with you about the legend of them, let's go back and look at that mosaic once again. So in Christian art, even from the earliest of centuries, whenever we see the Magi depicted, usually they're depicted with some differing characteristics. Now, if you look at this one, again, this one is in Italy today, but if you look at these three men, you'll see that they're dressed in a very similar way. They're all carrying, the gifts that they can carry in their hands. There's a lot of similarities between the three of them, but if you look for what's different about them, you'll see that the one on the far right has a beard, but it's a white beard, and he has white hair. He's an older gentleman. You move to the middle one, you have one that's clean shaven. He looks to be more youthful. If you compare his facial features to the one on the right, you'll see that he doesn't have the lines in his face. His skin is fairer, hasn't been out in the sun perhaps quite as much, and by the time you move all the way to the left, you'll see that you have a man who's somewhere in between the other two. He's bearded, he looks older, maybe more in midlife. And so you look at these three and you look at the other kind of artwork and the depiction of the Magi, and you will see that very intentionally in this representation and in many others, you'll see that they are at different ages. Somebody who's in early life, somebody who's in midlife, and somebody who is in a later stage of life. If we look at the other depictions in artwork, you'll see that the pigmentation of the Magi is often different from one to the next. Even after the service, if you want to come up and look at these three up here, they have very different kind of skin tones on the three Magi. If we follow that one of them came from Ethiopia instead of Arabia, you'll see that this middle Magi, who has skin that is a darker pigmentation, he looks like he is of African descent. He would be, in the story, Balthazar. So you will see that in the depictions. And so the reason behind sharing all of this, and this has to be the point you're probably at now, which is that's all interesting background information, but so what? Which is the right question to ask. So what? The so what is this: Africa, Asia, the Middle East, old, middle age, young, varying skin tones, the level of education and the wealth that come from the Magi in juxtaposition to the shepherds who are grazing other people's sheep on other people's land and sleeping in caves at night alongside the shepherds. This is the guest list for the birth of the Son of God. These are the people who gathered at the manger. When Matthew tells this story, and in the legends that followed from that, and the depictions in art and sculpture that have been created throughout the centuries, what we see is a global representation an international gathering at the manger. This is not some 20th or 21st century desire for the church to spin this to be some kind of PC inclusive message. And I'm all for that anyway, but that's not the origins of this. The origins of this is that by God's design, shepherds, the bottom strata of the social ladder, and the magi, international visitors with wealth, means, and education, gather side by side, bow to a knee, and worship the Son of God, the Word made flesh, the light of the world. So what? The so what is all of those obscure details seem to point to the same thing, the same truth, that God has gathered the world at the birth of Jesus Christ. And if we take so what a step further, what's that got to do with you and me? It means that if the world is gathered at the manger, then you and I are on that guest list too. Because somewhere between lowly shepherd and fancy magi are you and I. We're welcome there. We're on the list of those to be invited. There's a message for us there. When God said, I am going to make my debut, who do I want to have there? It was people like you and me, shepherds and wise men, and everyone in between. A very purposeful, detail-rich story is being woven even within 8 sentences that is meant to communicate a message of inclusion, of global scope and perspective, of hope, not just for Bethlehem, not just for Judah, not just for Israel, but for humankind, now and for always. When God says, what's that story going to be like as it takes root in your life? As you come home to the manger this year, as this story clicks with you anew, that there is light, that there is hope, and that you are not only welcomed at the manger, you are wanted there. As we begin the church year in Advent, as we begin to lay down our preparations and ready ourselves for what is yet to come, remember the hope of this message. Remember that all of these minuscule details point to that larger picture of Christ beckoning us. And once we have received that message, we will never be the same again. Thanks be to God for a vision, a picture so grand, a story captured in 8 sentences that could change our lives and change this very world.